What happens when one of music's biggest superstars meets late-night television's most notorious host, and a simple interview spirals into the most explosive confrontation in talk show history? Tonight, we're diving deep into the shocking moment when Mariah Carey was literally kicked off Jimmy Kimmel's show after a heated exchange that left everyone speechless. This isn't just another celebrity feud. This is a masterclass in how power dynamics can destroy careers in a matter of minutes. Before we get started, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling me what you think really happened behind the scenes, because trust me, you're going to want to discuss this one. The stage was set for what should have been a routine promotional appearance. Mariah Carey, the five-octave vocal powerhouse, had arrived at the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio to discuss her latest project. The atmosphere backstage was electric, with crew members buzzing about having such an iconic performer on the show. Mariah's team had been meticulous in their preparation, ensuring every detail was perfect for what they expected to be a career-highlighting interview. Her styling team had spent hours perfecting her look, choosing an elegant ensemble that reflected her status as music royalty, while still being appropriate for the casual late-night television format. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his sharp wit and sometimes cutting humor, had his own agenda that night. Sources close to the production revealed that he had been researching controversial topics and preparing what he called his most provocative questions yet. The host had been dealing with declining ratings and was desperate for a viral moment that would put his show back on the map. What better way to achieve that than by going after one of the most beloved figures in entertainment? His production team had noticed his increasingly aggressive interview style over the past few months, but none of them had the courage to confront him about it, especially when the network executives seemed to encourage anything that generated social media buzz. As Mariah settled into the guest chair, her radiant smile lighting up the studio, she had no idea what was coming. The audience was filled with her fans, many of whom had waited hours just to catch a glimpse of their idol. Some had traveled from different states, carrying signs and wearing shirts with her lyrics printed on them. The energy was palpable, and everyone expected this to be another charming late-night interview filled with laughs and promotional material. The warm-up comedian had gotten the crowd excited, telling them they were about to witness television magic with one of the greatest voices of all time. Jimmy started innocently enough, asking about her upcoming tour dates and recent collaborations. Mariah answered with her characteristic grace and humor, sharing behind-the-scenes stories that had the audience laughing and applauding. She spoke passionately about her creative process and the challenges of staying relevant in an ever-changing industry. Her answers were thoughtful and engaging, exactly what any host would want from a guest of her caliber. She discussed her latest album with genuine enthusiasm, explaining how different songs represented different chapters of her life and career evolution. The conversation flowed naturally for the first 10 minutes, with Jimmy appearing genuinely interested in her artistic journey. Mariah talked about working with new producers, how the industry had changed since she started, and her thoughts on supporting emerging artists. She even shared a funny story about a recording session mishap that had the entire audience in stitches. This was the Mariah Carey that fans loved. Warm, relatable, and incredibly talented. Someone who had managed to stay grounded despite decades of superstardom. But then something shifted in Jimmy's demeanor. His questions became more pointed, more personal. He began probing into her past relationships with a persistence that made everyone in the studio uncomfortable. Mariah's publicist, watching from the wings, started to show visible signs of concern as the questions veered away from the agreed-upon topics. The host's tone changed from playful to almost interrogative, as if he was conducting some kind of expose rather than a friendly chat. His body language became more aggressive, leaning forward in his chair like a predator sizing up its prey. You could see the confusion in Mariah's eyes as she tried to understand why the interview had taken this sudden turn. She had done hundreds of interviews throughout her career, and she knew the difference between legitimate curiosity and malicious intent. This was starting to feel like the latter. Her media training kicked in, and she attempted to redirect the conversation back to safer territory, but Jimmy seemed determined to push boundaries that should never have been approached in the first place. The first real moment of tension came when Jimmy brought up her previous marriages with unnecessary detail and a condescending tone that suggested he was somehow superior to the woman sitting across from him. He made snide comments about her personal choices, as if her private life was somehow fair game for public ridicule. Mariah handled it with professionalism at first, deflecting with humor and trying to steer the conversation back to her music. But Jimmy wasn't having it. He pressed harder, asking invasive questions about her personal life that had nothing to do with why she was there. The audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. What had started as excited anticipation was turning into something much darker. Longtime fans of late-night television recognized that this was crossing lines that even the most provocative hosts usually respected. There was a difference between playful teasing and outright disrespect, and Jimmy was rapidly approaching the latter. Some audience members started looking around at each other with confused expressions, wondering if this was some kind of planned bit that they weren't in on. You could see the exact moment when Mariah realized this wasn't going to be the respectful interview she had been promised. Her body language shifted, her smile became more forced, and there was a steel in her eyes that longtime fans recognized as her protective mode kicking in. She had dealt with difficult interviewers before, but this felt different. This felt like an ambush. Her years of experience in the music industry had taught her to recognize when someone was trying to tear her down for their own gain. The veteran performer straightened in her chair, and you could practically see her mental armor sliding into place. This was someone who had survived decades in one of the most brutal industries in the world, who had faced down record executives, critics, and competitors who had tried to diminish her talent and success. She wasn't about to let some late-night television host with obvious insecurity issues add his name to that list. The audience, initially charmed by both personalities, began to sense the growing tension. What had started as excited murmurs turned into uncomfortable silence as people realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't playful banter between a host and guest. This was starting to feel like a deliberate attempt to humiliate one of music's most respected artists. The camera operators were getting signals from the control room, but no one seemed to know exactly how to handle what was unfolding in real time. Jimmy seemed to feed off the discomfort, pushing even harder with questions that would have made any reasonable person walk away. His eyes had a gleam that suggested he was enjoying the power he thought he held over his guest. But Mariah Carey didn't become a legend by backing down from challenges. She had faced down much more powerful people than Jimmy Kimmel and come out victorious. This was about to become another one of those moments, except this time it was going to be captured on television for the world to see. She straightened in her chair, and with the poise that had carried her through decades in the spotlight, she prepared to defend herself in what was about to become television history. The Queen was about to remind everyone in that studio exactly why she wore the crown. That moment of silent preparation was all Mariah needed to gather her legendary composure, but what came next would shatter any pretense of civility. Jimmy, clearly emboldened by what he perceived as vulnerability, made the fatal mistake of questioning her vocal abilities and suggesting that her best days were behind her. He actually had the audacity to imply that her recent performances weren't up to the standard of her earlier work, completely ignoring the fact that she had been consistently delivering world-class performances for over 3 decades. The words hung in the air like a poison cloud, and you could actually hear gasps from the audience members who understood they had just witnessed a line being crossed that should never have been approached. The attack was particularly cruel because it targeted the very foundation of Mariah's identity as an artist. This wasn't just casual rudeness. This was a calculated attempt to undermine someone's life work on national television. Jimmy's smirk suggested he thought he had landed a devastating blow, but he had no idea what kind of response he was about to receive. The camera caught every micro-expression on both their faces, the moment when Predator thought he had wounded his prey, and the moment when the prey revealed she was actually the apex predator in this encounter. Mariah's response was swift and devastating. With the precision of someone who had dealt with industry politics for over 3 decades, she calmly explained that she had sold more records than most artists could ever dream of, and that her influence on music would outlast whatever temporary platform he thought he was providing her. Her voice remained steady, but there was an underlying power that reminded everyone in that studio exactly who they were dealing with. This wasn't just any pop star. This was royalty defending her throne, against someone who had clearly forgotten his place in the entertainment hierarchy. She delivered statistics that made Jimmy's jaw drop. Grammy nominations, Billboard #1s, multi-platinum certifications, awards from every major music organization in the world. But more than that, she talked about the artists who had cited her as an influence, the vocalists who had tried to emulate her range, the songwriters who had studied her compositions. She wasn't just defending her past achievements, she was demonstrating that her impact on music was immeasurable and permanent, while his contribution to entertainment would likely be forgotten within a few years of his show's inevitable cancellation. But Jimmy made his second critical error by doubling down. Instead of recognizing that he had gone too far and attempting to salvage the situation, he actually laughed at her response and made a comment about divas who couldn't handle real questions. The word diva dripped with contempt, as if being passionate and demanding excellence was somehow a character flaw rather than the quality that had made her one of the most successful artists in history. The studio went dead silent. Even the cameramen seemed to freeze, unsure whether they should keep rolling or cut to commercial. This was uncharted territory in late-night television, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would have lasting consequences. The use of the word diva was particularly loaded, and everyone in the entertainment industry knew it. It was a term that had been weaponized against strong women in music for decades, a way to dismiss their legitimate concerns and professional standards as unreasonable behavior. Jimmy had just revealed his true colors, showing that beneath his supposedly progressive comedy was the same old misogyny that had plagued the industry for years. Mariah had heard this kind of language before, but never from someone who was supposed to be providing her with a professional platform to promote her work. You could see the exact moment when something snapped inside her, not in an uncontrolled way, but like a master strategist who had just decided that diplomacy was no longer an option. Mariah stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful despite the obvious anger building inside her. Every eye in the studio was fixed on her as she rose to her full height, and suddenly Jimmy looked much smaller in his chair. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and everyone could feel it. She looked directly into Jimmy's eyes and delivered what would become one of the most quoted responses in talk show history. She told him that respect was earned, not demanded, and that he had just demonstrated why his show was struggling to stay relevant in a world that valued authentic connection over cheap controversy. Her words cut through the tension like a blade, precise and devastating. She explained that real interviewers knew how to challenge their guests without resorting to personal attacks, and that his behavior revealed more about his own insecurities than it did about her supposed flaws. The psychological analysis was brutal and accurate. She pointed out that people who felt the need to tear others down usually did so because they were deeply unhappy with their own achievements. She suggested that maybe his recent rating struggles had affected his judgment, and that he was taking out his professional frustrations on guests who had nothing to do with his career problems. Every word was calculated to expose the pathetic nature of his behavior while maintaining her own dignity throughout the exchange. The host, perhaps realizing for the first time that he had severely miscalculated, tried to backtrack with nervous laughter and claims that he was just joking around. His voice had lost all of its earlier confidence, and sweat was beginning to form on his forehead despite the air conditioning in the studio. But Mariah was beyond the point of accepting hollow apologies or fake explanations. She had given him multiple opportunities to course correct, and he had chosen to escalate instead. Now she was going to show him exactly what happened when someone disrespected not just her, but the art form she had dedicated her life to perfecting. She continued, speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. She talked about the responsibility that came with having a platform, about how interviewers were supposed to lift up their guests rather than tear them down. She explained that entertainment was supposed to bring joy to people, not provide a forum for insecure hosts to work out their personal issues at the expense of their guests. The lecture was masterful, combining personal defense with broader social commentary about the state of media and entertainment. What happened next was a masterclass in how to handle a bully with grace and strength. Mariah didn't raise her voice or resort to the kind of dramatic theatrics that lesser performers might have used. Instead, she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had earned every bit of her success through talent, hard work, and perseverance. She explained that she had come to his show as a courtesy, to promote her work and connect with fans, not to be subjected to amateur-hour psychology from someone who clearly had his own issues to work through. Her composure was absolutely devastating to Jimmy's position. While he was sweating and stammering, she remained poised and articulate. The contrast was stark and obvious to everyone watching. This was someone who had handled much more pressure than a failing late-night television host, and she was demonstrating exactly why she had survived and thrived in the entertainment industry for so long. She had faced down record executives, industry politics, personal tragedies, and career challenges that would have destroyed lesser artists. Jimmy's face began to show the first signs of panic as he realized this situation was spiraling completely out of his control. His usual arsenal of deflection and humor was useless against someone who refused to play his games. Every attempt he made to regain control of the conversation was met with intelligent, measured responses that only made him look more foolish and unprofessional. Mariah continued speaking, pointing out that his behavior was not just unprofessional, but revealed a deeper problem with how he viewed women in the entertainment industry. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was speaking for every female artist who had ever been subjected to this kind of treatment. She talked about the double standards that existed in entertainment, how male artists were rarely asked the same invasive personal questions, how women were expected to smile and take abuse in the name of being good sports. Her words resonated with everyone in the studio who had ever felt marginalized or disrespected because of their gender or success. The audience was completely transfixed. Some were recording on their phones, others were simply staring in amazement at witnessing such a powerful moment of someone standing up for themselves with such elegance and strength. This was a demonstration of what real power looked like when it was wielded with purpose and dignity. People were witnessing history being made, a moment that would be studied and discussed for years to come. Jimmy tried one last desperate attempt to regain control by suggesting that maybe she was being too sensitive and couldn't handle tough questions like other guests. It was the worst possible thing he could have said. The words revealed everything that was wrong with his approach and his attitude toward his guests, particularly female guests. Mariah's eyes flashed with a fire that reminded everyone why she had survived and thrived in one of the most brutal industries in the world. She was about to deliver the final blow that would end this interview permanently and leave Jimmy Kimmel looking like the small, petty man. That final insult about sensitivity was the spark that ignited what would become the most legendary talk show moment in television history. Mariah Carey, with decades of experience dealing with industry politics and media manipulation, looked directly at Jimmy Kimmel and delivered a response that would be replayed millions of times across social media. She told him that sensitivity was actually a strength, that it allowed artists to create meaningful work that touched people's lives. something he clearly wouldn't understand given his track record of punching down at people more talented than himself. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had used that very sensitivity to create songs that had provided comfort to millions of people during their darkest moments. She continued with surgical precision, explaining how sensitivity enabled her to connect with audiences on a deeper level, to understand human emotions and translate them into music that resonated across cultures and generations. She pointed out that his apparent inability to understand this concept was exactly why his comedy felt so hollow and mean-spirited. Real entertainers, she explained, used their platforms to uplift and inspire, not to tear down and diminish. The psychological insight was devastating because it was so obviously true. The words hit Jimmy like a physical blow. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, anger, and finally a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of control over his own show. You could see him trying to process what had just happened, how an interview he thought he was controlling had been completely turned around on him. But Mariah wasn't finished. She was just getting started, and everyone in the studio could sense that this was building to something unprecedented in television history. She continued with the kind of articulate fury that only comes from years of dealing with people who underestimate your intelligence and strength. She talked about how his behavior was a perfect example of what was wrong with modern media, how the pursuit of cheap viral moments had replaced genuine entertainment and meaningful conversation. She explained that his desperation for attention was so obvious that it was actually embarrassing to witness, and that his willingness to humiliate guests revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what entertainment was supposed to be. The analysis was clinical and devastating. She broke down his interview technique, explaining how real professionals manage to ask challenging questions without resorting to personal attacks or cheap shots. She pointed out that his approach revealed more about his own limitations as an interviewer than it did about his guests' ability to handle difficult topics. Every word was carefully chosen to expose the amateurish nature of his tactics while demonstrating her own superior understanding of media dynamics. Mariah's verbal demolition continued as she explained that his behavior was exactly why late-night television was becoming increasingly irrelevant, because audiences were tired of watching mediocre men tear down extraordinary women for cheap laughs and temporary viral moments. She talked about how the entertainment landscape was changing, how audiences were demanding more authenticity and less manufactured controversy. His style of hosting, she suggested, was a relic of a less enlightened time that was rapidly being left behind. The sociological commentary was brilliant and cutting. She positioned herself as representing the future of entertainment, while painting him as a dinosaur clinging to outdated methods. She talked about how younger audiences were rejecting the kind of mean-spirited comedy that had characterized previous generations of late-night television. Her analysis was so comprehensive and intelligent that it left Jimmy with no room to respond without looking even more foolish. Jimmy's response revealed the true depths of his unprofessionalism. Instead of accepting responsibility for his behavior or attempting to apologize sincerely, he actually had the audacity to tell Mariah that she was being difficult and that other guests didn't have these kinds of problems with his interview style. The implication was clear. He was suggesting that the problem was with her, not with his complete lack of respect and basic human decency. The statement was so tone-deaf and revealing that several audience members could be heard groaning in disbelief. Your comment about other guests was particularly telling, because it revealed Jimmy's complete inability to understand that different people deserved different levels of respect based on their achievements and contributions to entertainment. He was essentially admitting that he had been bullying other guests who had been too polite or too intimidated to call him out on his behavior. Mariah had just become the first person with enough stature and courage to hold him accountable publicly. Mariah's laugh in response was perhaps the most devastating sound ever captured on late-night television. It wasn't bitter or angry, it was The laugh of someone who had just realized exactly how small and pathetic the person across from her really was. The laugh contained decades of experience dealing with people who thought they could diminish her, and it conveyed both amusement and pity in equal measure. She had heard this kind of deflection before from record executives, critics, and competitors who couldn't accept responsibility for their own poor behavior. She stood up with the poise of a queen and told Jimmy that she pitied him, because his desperate need to diminish others revealed how little he thought of himself. The psychological insight was brutal and accurate, and everyone in the studio knew it. She explained that confident people didn't need to tear others down to feel good about themselves, and that his behavior was a textbook example of projection and insecurity. The analysis was so precise that it left Jimmy completely speechless. The moment was captured perfectly by the cameras, showing the stark contrast between someone who had earned their success through talent and hard work, and someone who had stumbled into a position of temporary power without developing the character to handle it responsibly. Mariah continued explaining that his behavior wasn't just unprofessional. It was a perfect example of what happened when people were given platforms they hadn't earned and responsibilities they weren't mature enough to handle. What happened next shocked everyone, including the production crew who had been scrambling to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. Jimmy Kimmel, perhaps realizing that he was being completely outclassed and humiliated on his own show, made the desperate decision to have Mariah escorted out of the studio. He actually called for security to remove one of the most successful recording artists in history from his show, as if she were some kind of troublemaker rather than a guest who had been defending herself against his unprovoked attacks. The decision to call security was so obviously inappropriate that it seemed to stun everyone in the studio. This wasn't someone who had been threatening or disruptive. This was someone who had been articulate, intelligent, and completely in control of herself while defending against completely unprofessional treatment. The fact that Jimmy thought this was an appropriate response only further revealed how completely out of touch he was with basic standards of professional behavior. The security guards who appeared looked absolutely mortified. They knew they were being asked to escort a legend out of the building, and their reluctance was obvious to everyone watching. These were people who had probably grown up listening to Mariah's music, and now they were being asked to treat her like some kind of security threat. Their body language showed how uncomfortable they were with the situation, and several of them looked like they wanted to apologize as they approached her. Mariah handled even this ultimate insult with incredible grace, gathering her things and preparing to leave while maintaining her dignity throughout the entire humiliating process that Jimmy had orchestrated. She didn't argue with the security guards or create additional drama. She simply collected her belongings with the same poise she had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. Her behavior stood in stark contrast to Jimmy's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control of a situation that had completely spiraled away from him. But before she left, Mariah delivered her final statement, one that would haunt Jimmy Kimmel for the rest of his career. She told him that he had just demonstrated to the world exactly who he really was, and that no amount of damage control or public relations could undo what everyone had just witnessed. She explained that character was revealed in moments of pressure, and that his choices during this interview had shown everyone his true nature. The words were delivered with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. She continued by explaining that respect was a two-way street, and that he had chosen to burn his bridges with not just her, but with every artist who would now think twice before appearing on his show. She predicted that his behavior would have lasting consequences for his career, and that the entertainment industry had a long memory when it came to people who mistreated their colleagues. The warning was delivered with the authority of someone who had enough influence to make it come true. As Mariah walked toward the exit, something remarkable happened. The audience, who had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, began to applaud. It started with a few people and quickly grew into thunderous applause that filled the entire studio. They were applauding not just a performer, but someone who had stood up for herself and for every person who had ever been bullied by someone in a position of power. The ovation lasted for several minutes, and many people in the audience were standing. The applause was so sustained and enthusiastic that it created an even more humiliating situation for Jimmy. Here was his own audience, in his own studio, giving a standing ovation to someone he had just had escorted out of the building. The message was clear. They supported her, not him. The cameras captured every moment of the applause, and you could see Jimmy sitting at his desk, clearly shaken and unsure how to proceed with the rest of the show. Jimmy sat at his desk, clearly shaken and unsure how to proceed. His attempt to salvage the situation by making jokes to the audience fell completely flat. The crowd that had been so enthusiastic at the beginning of the show now seemed to view him with a mixture of disappointment and disgust. He had wanted a viral moment, and he had certainly gotten one, but not in the way he had intended. Instead of generating buzz for his show, he had created a moment that would be remembered as one of the most unprofessional incidents in television history. The aftermath in the studio was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Crew members were looking at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to embarrassment. The production assistants who had been excited about having such a major star on the show now looked like they wished they could disappear. Everyone present knew they had just witnessed something that would have serious consequences for the show and for Jimmy's career. The final image of the confrontation was Mariah Carey walking out of the studio with her head held high, while Jimmy Kimmel sat alone at his desk, having revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person that the entertainment industry needed fewer of, not more. The contrast between dignity and desperation, between class and cruelty, could not have been more stark. She had entered the studio as a guest and left as a legend who had just delivered one of the most powerful performances of her career. The incident would be talked about for years to come, not just as entertainment gossip, but as a masterclass in how to handle bullies and defend yourself with grace and intelligence. Mariah had shown that you didn't need to stoop to someone's level to defeat them. You just needed to be better than them in every way that mattered. So what did you think of this incredible confrontation? Was Jimmy Kimmel completely out of line, or do you think there's more to the story? Make sure to subscribe for more shocking celebrity stories and drop a comment below telling me which talk show host you think treats their guests the worst, because after this story I'm thinking we need to have a serious conversation about accountability in late-night television.